Hello there, welcome to my review of the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, episode 6, The Cardboard Box. This is the final episode of the Jeremy Brett series and is a fascinating way to bow out. Jeremy is back and it's Christmas.
How am I supposed to think up yet another present for Watson? I mean, every year you inflict this agony.
But this is more M.R. James than Charles Dickens. The episode begins with the Cushing sisters, Sarah and Susan, celebrating the wedding of their younger sister Mary to sailor Jim Browner, before we arrive at Baker Street with Watson and Holmes in their familiar seats, and it feels like we're very much in old Holmes territory. Inspector Hawkins arrives to consult on a series of grave robberies, and Hawkins invites Holmes to Scotland Yard for a Christmas party. It is a shame that it's not Lestrade in this episode, giving him a final farewell, but Hawkins does a fine job as a substitute. It's also a lot of fun to see Holmes frustrated by the idea of Christmas shopping, as Mrs. Hudson tries to get his rooms into the festive spirit.
Did you go to Gamage's?
Gamage's?
Yes, it's in Holborn, a departmental store.
We discover more about Susan and Sarah Cushing, as Susan admonishes their lodger for eating in the kitchen, and he makes accusations about getting permission from Sarah, as well as permissions about some other things.
I'd be most surprised if my sister gave the run of the kitchen to my lodger.
It made me warden at the mission.
Now you ask her what she gave me. You English are such hypocrites. Now you tell her what you gave me.
What's going...
Susan is a particularly pious woman, and kicks them both out, but not before revealing that Mary has seemingly run away from her husband without a word to anyone.
Mary has gone away without telling anyone? Good. Sometimes I think you're not just feckless, I think you're deliberately irresponsible.
There's an enormous amount going on in this scene, both said and unsaid, as we get a picture of Susan, initially cold, but for the time would have been considered respectable to a fault. Deeply protective over the family name and status, despite Sarah being seemingly more modern in her ideas of propriety. However, this is really a veil she wears to protect herself, as we see when Sarah gives her some home truths.
One day this diet of respectability is going to make you ill.
You are so horrid.
With Susan engaging Holmes in the disappearance of her young sister Mary, Christmas Eve draws in and Holmes visits Scotland Yard. Susan opens gifts that have been delivered to her, one of which is a box of salt, containing 2 human ears. Hawkins comes to Holmes with this case, suspecting the lodger, as he was a medical student, and as soon as Holmes hears the name, he rushes to inspect the ears. Watson reveals that the ears are not a pair, and Holmes tells them that this is no practical joke from a medical student, as the ears are not from a medical cadaver.
What first strikes you when you enter a dissecting room?
Formaldehyde. Damn it, it should smell of formaldehyde.
And it does not.
While this examination is going on, Sarah arrives to give Susan her Christmas gift, but having been pushed over the edge by the horrific package she'd previously received, she accuses Sarah of introducing their sister to other men, while driving her husband back to drink, an addiction he had previously overcome with Mary's help. We then see a flashback of Sarah helping the newlyweds, while Mary is absent, attempting to seduce Jim, revealing more about her character. Back in the present, under the gentle probing of Sherlock, Susan reveals the family's recent history, and urges him to question Sarah about the failure of Mary and Jim's marriage. But, having discovered the ears, Sarah has fled. Holmes is troubled by the state of affairs, but is able to provide some clarity on the unrelated body snatching. As all the bodies were dead boxers, he suspects a doctor researching impact-related brain damage, and Watson is able to provide a name. With that dealt with, he visits Sarah, who says Mary has gone off with her lover, and it was indeed the medical student who sent the ears, but Holmes doesn't believe a word of it. With the facts of the case in front of him, Holmes is able to conclude what happened. That Jim Browner caught Mary with her lover, murdered them both, severing the ears and sending them to Sarah, in order to basically say that this is her doing.
Look at me, Sarah Cushing. This is your handiwork.
But by addressing the package to S. Cushing, it meant they were delivered to the wrong sister. Expecting to intercept Browner, Holmes' plans are dashed by Watson pointing out the trains are running their Christmas timetable, and they're forced to rush into action. However, Browner is already at Sarah's house before Holmes can rouse the police. Browner confronts her, blaming her directly for what he did, poisoning him against Mary and Mary against him, purely because Sarah fancied him.
They have arrested the lodger. You can get away.
Get away. It's in here! Every last moment of it!
She claims to have done everything she did out of love for him, which he rejects yet again, just as Holmes arrives. In prison, Browner tells Holmes his side of the story. How he had not mentioned Sarah's advances towards him to Mary, but how Sarah had used this to drive a wedge between him and his wife, driving him back to drink and urging Mary to pursue someone else. A gentleman, in contrast to the humble Browner, a sailor. Also, Sarah might have her revenge on Browner for rejecting her, and still have him to herself in the process. He asks not to be left on his own in his cell, and Sherlock understands his meaning.
When I leave, I'll send an officer in.
As Holmes escorts the police to where Browner dumped the bodies. Confronted by the memory of what he did, Browner is left a broken man, while Sarah seems to show some remorse for what she did, although this is not made entirely clear. Holmes has the last word on the matter.
What is the meaning of it, Watson? What is the object of this circle of misery and violence and fear? It must have a purpose, or our universe has no meaning, and that is unthinkable.
For me, this is perhaps the darkest and most complex of all the Holmes canon, certainly of this adaptation. Sarah is a selfish, calculating, but ultimately naive villain, who seems to be completely amoral in her actions, or at the very least unwilling to think of the consequences of those actions, beyond getting what she wants. Susan is at first cold and stuck in the norms of the time, however also may be acting out of a strong moral code, merely cloaked in the standards of Victorian society. Browner is a tragic figure, whose actions can't be condoned, but can be understood, as he possesses a frailty, wonderfully realised in Kieran Hines' performance, that comes with addiction, and yet is ultimately willing to accept responsibility for what he did. While Holmes seems to be an impartial observer for most of this story, he reveals at the end that he was merely putting up a defensive wall, until the time was right to make how he felt known. He didn't need to speak to Browner when he did, because he already knew everything, and yet was there to listen because he felt pity for him. It may not have been intended to be the final episode, but I think it's the perfect ending for the series, particularly with Holmes's final speech, and is a fitting, if somewhat depressing, ending to the show. For me, this is a 5 out of 5, although not one that I tend to revisit during the festive season. Thank you. Goodbye.